The following podcast will be discussing vaccination in animals, not in humans. This is our opinion and is not meant for medical advice. Please follow all laws and local ordinances when raising backyard chickens. Welcome to the 2 Acre Homestead Podcast. Come along with us on our journey from a small suburban homestead lifestyle
to our new lifestyle homesteading in the rural countryside of Upper Lower Michigan.
We'll share with you our tips, tricks, successes, and failures.
From both our past suburban lifestyle to our new rural lifestyle, all on the 2 Acre Homestead Podcast. Welcome back. Well, this is going to be an interesting episode this week. And as many people know, the prices of eggs have been crazy for a bit. And probably by the launching of this particular episode, the prices, I guess, are supposed to come down a bit. But in addition, there have been a lot of news reports about millions and millions of chickens that have been culled because of the effects of the viruses we're going to be talking about. So let's get into it because this is going to be an interesting discussion.
Yes, it is going to be an interesting episode this week. You know, our society as a whole is very polarized right now. And I know there are several people who take the position that avian bird flu just doesn't exist. Some people feel that the egg crisis that's going on right now is being generated by greed. And then there are some who take the polar opposite, who believe there is actually a bird flu that is going on, and that the practices that are being done need to be done in order to, for lack of a better term, neutralize the threat. So what I have done is I've really gone down a rabbit hole when it comes to researching this. I am not a virologist. I'm not a scientist, although if I had to go back through school again rather than studying accounting, I think I probably would have stuck with science because I absolutely love science. That being said, I did take out some time to do a lot of research. I pulled a lot of published papers. And what I mean by published papers is published scientific papers. All of my reference work for this particular podcast will be in the show notes, will be in the description. You can also read the same articles that I have read. So without further ado, as of the recording of this podcast, the current situation in January 2025 is that over 23 million birds in the U.S. have been culled because of bird flu. Of that 23 million, 18.8 million were egg layers. 2.2 million were broilers. And I still can't find what happened to the other 2 million. I am suspecting that they might be other bird fowl, such as turkeys, some other type of bird fowl. But this is not a good thing. This is, obviously it is contributing to the current prices that we see in the grocery store where, a carton of eggs, like a 12 count of eggs is now $10 per carton. So this is not a good thing.
And maybe just to ask, and I don't know if you have the data on that, but out of the about almost 19 million egg layers that were culled in January of 2025, how significant is that as far as how many were in the population
I don't have that exact number. Um, I'm sure it's buried somewhere in my research. I do seem to remember seeing it, but off of the top of my head, I do not know.
But
And it's not here in my notes.
Okay. But it was significant enough to be at least part of the cause of the prices going up.
Absolutely.
Because, that's quite a few birds to take out of the population.
Out of the food system.
Out of the food system.
Exactly. Yeah. And I do remember that it was significantly higher than that which what was culled in December of 2024, the month prior. So January seems to have been a very big month for bird flu culling. So it was pretty big. But I asked myself when I was looking at this, I asked myself, well, why? Why is it that, they're coming through and they're killing all of these birds because of the H5N1 bird influenza virus?
Right. To your point, many people have been saying, well, it's greed.
Right. Some people say it's greed. But when you look at it, normal farming practices are if an animal is sick, you isolate that animal. And if it's a flock or herd and they've been exposed, then you keep watch over that flock and herd, and you keep the ones that are resistant to that particular disease. That's normal farming. I would dare say that's farming 101. That's like basics. You don't just because one animal is sick, you don't just cull everybody. But as I dug deeper, the information that I found was really interesting. So bear with me, because in order to know why we are where we are today, it's important to know the history of where we have been. If you don't know your history, then you don't know why you are where you are in this, in any situation in life. So avian influenza, that has been around for quite some time. And it was first identified by Eduardo Perencito. I think I'm pronouncing his name right. I'm not sure. But he first discovered it back in 1878. That's a long time ago. 1878 is when this man first discovered avian influenza. It was differentiated from other diseases that caused high mortality rates in birds. By the time 1955 came around, it was established that bird flu was actually a virus and was closely related to human influenza. Then you fast forward to 1972, and it became evident that many subtypes of avian flu were endemic in wild bird population. What does that mean, endemic? That means that is something that's always there. They always have it. It's always in the bird population, but it's in the wild bird population. So between 1959 and 1995, there were 15 recorded outbreaks of HPAI influenza. That stands for highly pathogenic avian influenza. And that was in poultry birds. And the losses, they varied from just maybe like a few on a single farm to millions on some. Between 1996 and 2008, that's when that was recorded. So those HPA outbreaks in poultry, they've been recorded at least 11 times, and 4 of those outbreaks have resulted in millions of birds being culled. So the modern strain that we see today of the H5N1 bird flu was first detected in infected birds back in 1996. And human cases and death were first confirmed back in 1997. Okay. The virus, the H5N1, it spreads most readily between birds, though it's resulted in a total of 887 confirmed human cases and 463 confirmed deaths, most of those occurring between the years of 2004 to 2015. Known human infections have only occurred as a result of direct contact with infected birds. There's been no observed human-to-human transmission, although I do believe last year was the first recorded human-to-human transmission. But we will see the results of that. So let those dates, just let that linger in the air for a minute. 2004 to 2015. Okay. The reason is we're going to see a convergence of another pathozoopic meaning a pathogen that only is supposed to be in animals. It's not supposed to be in humans. So it's pathozoopic virus come into play. In walks Merck's disease. Birds, if you are familiar with birds, they are highly susceptible to a disease called Merck's. And that can infect a bird within a few days after hatching. It's an airborne disease, and it infects susceptible hosts through the respiratory tract. The Merck's disease virus, it is shed from the infected bird's feather follicles. So, in other words, let's say you have one bird who's infected with this Merck disease. It flaps its wings. It's now shedding the virus. If we've been through COVID, we know that expression, shedding the virus. It's shedding the virus through the feather follicles. And any other bird that's around is going to get this disease through the airways. So that's why a lot of times you'll find anytime that you get a bird from a hatchery, you'll notice the setup of hatcheries have the eggs that are being incubated often either in a different building or in a completely isolated part of a building, separated and isolated from the flock that the eggs came from, because they are trying to avoid this highly contagious Merck's disease. Once the eggs are hatched, within a day or two, they are injected with the vaccine for this Merck's disease. This has been going on since 1969. The vaccination of Merck's disease has been going on since 1969. And the Merck disease vaccines can prevent the tumor growth. It prevents death in the infected birds. But they are in the ones that were developed in 1969 up to 2006, those vaccines were ineffective against the viral shedding and replication of the disease. What is the replication? These are terms that I'm sure people are like, what? And it's just exactly what it means, the disease replicating itself. Those vaccines could not prevent that.
Well, for example, the common flu, every year there are mutations, and I don't remember offhand, but there are multiple variations going on. So when they come out with a flu vaccine, they have to kind of go with the common ones, because it's mutated so many times, and they try to mitigate that the best that they can.
So in 2006, it was discovered the Merrick disease vaccines don't prevent virus replication and shedding of the continuous virus, led to the emergence of a more virulent disease. Ideally, the successful vaccine would decrease and or stop the replication and shedding of the disease. So in 2006, enter the RNA vaccines. We all are familiar with mRNA. Now, the M in an mRNA means that you're telling the RNA in your DNA, you're telling it to recognize certain proteins. And the M stands for the messenger. So it's messaging, hey, the body, it's saying, hey, these particular, when you produce these proteins, when you see this thing going on. I'm just oversimplifying.
It's basically programming.
It's basic programming. That's basically what they're doing. And that is what all RNA vaccines do. Normal vaccines, that the ones prior, would actually inject you with, or not you, but because we're not talking about human injection, but they would inject the dead virus into, so the dead Merrick's virus into these animals and then let their immune system figure it out. Well, now with the mRNA, now they're programming their DNA to say, hey, we're going to produce this particular protein when we see this thing happen inside the body. So that started in 2006. So from 2006 all the way up to 2018, they have been using mRNA vaccines in various different animals. One of the other animals that they have been using these vaccines in is pigs, piglets, and the sows. And they have, like I said, we will include all of the scientific studies in the show notes. You can go look at it yourself. But they found that the RNA-based vaccines encoding antigenic targets are, and I'm reading this verbatim, promising platform against infectious disease and cancer. The mRNA platform retains a superior safety profile with no risk of genome integration, lack of anti-vector immunity, and transient expression. Well, that's a mouthful. That's, in other words, there's no risk. There's absolutely no risk, and it's so good, it might even be able to cure cancer. So they kept on putzing around with these mRNA vaccines. And the reason why we've taken kind of a right-hand turn on the subject, we are talking about avian flu, but we're talking about the mRNA vaccines because what they started to notice is that as time went on, they started to notice, they, meaning scientists, started to notice that since they had so much success with Merrick's disease, and with the piglets, that they could start using the mRNA vaccine for bird flu. And they did. So they started doing that in 2018. So fast forward to March of 2020. Do you remember what was going on in the world at that time?
COVID.
Yeah. While we were all distracted with COVID, there was something else that was brewing in the science world, in the zoological world, and that was avian flu. Now, up to this point, there are different forms of avian flu. And do not misunderstand me. Over the years, there has always been different mutations of bird flu. That's a standard. It's there's always going to be some sort of mutation. And that's why you hear people just simply say bird flu. But you'll hear the term H5N1 or a term I'm about to use, H7N3. What does the H and the N mean? To take the complexity out of it and just break this down for the people who are listening, who are our normal listeners, who are gardeners. If you're a gardener, you know that there are plant families. There's families of plants. For example, the Brassica family. I'm using this as an example. Within the Brassica family, there's cauliflower, there's cabbage, but all of them are a part of the same family of plant, which is Brassica. The H7H1 is a family clade, if you will. It's called a clade, but we'll just call it a family or a clan. They're all related. Some are more potent. Some have more virility, I guess is what you could say. I don't know if that's a word, but I think that is the word. They're more potent. You can get infected easier. Some are less. But nonetheless, all of these go to the avian influenza. So going back to March of 2020, there are two counties. There's Union County, and I can't think of the other county in North Carolina. There were turkey farms that the H7N3 avian, the H7N3, which is a low pathogenicity avian influenza type A virus, had affected 11 different turkey farms in North Carolina and one in South Carolina. Now, they did the right thing in that they took samples from all of these different farms and they sent it to a place called GenBank, and that's very well documented. They were able to figure out intravenous pathology. They indexed and they selected the different LPAIV strains, and they were able to document all of that. The reason why what happened in North Carolina in 2020 is so important is very simply what they have documented themselves. They said that these data support a single source of the H7N1 or N3 being introduced to the turkey farms in North Carolina, spreading laterally to other turkey premises and mutating once to HPAIV during replication in turkeys from a single barn on a turkey premises in South Carolina with no further reassortment with any other influenza strains. And then it goes on to say that although no wild bird origin precursor had all 8 segments that corresponded to the North Carolina and South Carolina H7N3 viruses, the most probable progenitor gene was identified for each individual segment as LPAIV, originating from wild waterfowl migrating along the Mississippi Flyway. These findings suggest that a precursor virus most likely emerged in the wild waterfowl with subsequent introduction into the poultry via a occasional virus spread between wild birds. The genomes of the North American LPIV appeared to reassort at a remarkably high rate with no apparent pattern in the gene segment association. Let me put this into English the way I understand this. Likely, this particular version, this H7N3, originated with birdfowl somewhere in the Mississippi Flyway. It got somehow transmitted to the barn in South Carolina, and it mutated quickly. Because remember, by this time, what's happening? Birds are getting vaccinated with mRNA vaccines for bird flu and for Merck's disease. They're getting those vaccines. So now a normal, in quotes, normal bird influenza is getting transmitted from the wild, and it's being put in a barn situation where it can now mutate. And based on what they're saying, a high rate of mutation. So in other words, it's quickly mutating into something else. And it's spread. It spread not just local, but cross state lines, like a virus knows to obey state lines. But the point is that it's spread over a distance. So here is my opinion based on everything that I have read. What happened in 2020 with the H7N3, this was a very contagious strain. But what's more contagious is the H5N1 version of bird flu. Remember, it's in the same family. And that is documented. That is not actually my opinion. Scientists agree it is more contagious. And this version of H5N1 that is highly contagious and that has been mutated, it's mutated a lot, because in 2022, H5N1 existed, but it did not cross pathology into human beings or other animals. It strictly stayed as an avian bird flu. But now it has mutated, and people are able to get the bird flu. Are there a lot of people? No. Over the grand scheme of things, since people have been keeping record, I think it's been about 800 people who have actually contracted bird flu. I'm talking about going all the way back to 1969, maybe even further. So there have been people who have contracted it, but not at this rate. And not at the rate that it has crossed into other animals. It has not been known to do that ever. And that's because it's mutating, it's changing, and it's changing so rapidly.
So at the outset, we mentioned nearly 19 million broilers that had been culled. Why are they taking that measure? Why is that necessary?
Well, look, the reason is because the virus has mutated and it's done it so quickly. The only way that they can control it is by getting rid of the animals that are carrying the disease, the mutation. If it was a normal mutation, then things would be going on just as they always have since people have been keeping records of bird flu. But because of the mutation of the H5N1 and because of the how quickly it's mutating. The thing that they're trying to do is just do away with the entire flock so that the virus itself, with all of its mutation, can go away. And I shouldn't say the virus itself, but the mutated version of this virus can go away. You're never going to get rid of bird flu. It's always going to be around. But this particular mutation that's been caused by these mRNA vaccines, that's what it seems to me. This is just my opinion, but it seems to me what they're trying to get rid of. Is it right? Is it ethical? No. I disagree with that. I don't think it's right. I don't think it's ethical, but that's just my opinion. And that's, as far as opinions are concerned, that's as far as I'm going to venture.
And just to clarify too, maybe just I had this question when listening to this too, is so you mentioned, of course, the historical way of protecting the rest of the flock. When you have one or two injured, diseased, you separate them.
Right.
But am I correct? It sounds like the reason why there's such a high number that they said, okay, they're going to cull this high number is because, one, it's the sheer numbers, because it's a large population that's affected with these strains. And then the other is it travels it through the air, and then it has jumped from animal to human.
Yeah, I mean, basically, they've opened the Pandora's box on all of this has been opened.
Well, they're trying to play God, right? By creating these vaccines that are going to do this, that, and the other, but then they don't fully know what they're doing, and then it spreads and it gets worse.
Right. And it's and I think out of all of the things that they could have done with the mRNA vaccines, birds probably were the worst, because birds do the one thing that we all know they do, and that is they travel and they poop everywhere. And birds are great. Don't get me wrong. I love birds, but they're highly mobile, and they're not the cleanest of animals. I don't mean that in a mean way, but they're not.
It brings to mind too that at least in America, Americans eat quite a bit of chicken every year.
They do. I did some research on that, and I don't think I have that in my notes either, but I will say that I forgot what agency it was. I think it was the USDA that I had researched on, and chicken is the most consumed here in the United States. Now, what's interesting is that when you start looking at other countries, when you start looking at it from a global perspective, chicken is the most consumed meat globally. And when you start going into countries that are, more advanced, what is it called? The more
first
world countries.
Yeah.
Okay. It's interesting when you start getting into first world countries. Yes, chicken is the most consumed animal. But then you also have something else that's going on, and that is you've got a larger population. So you've got more people eating things like chicken. You've got more countries eating and consuming chicken. So what does that mean? Well, the more people are consuming these animal products, the more production has to go up and higher. And that means you have more chicken farms. And, the backyard, the person who's producing their own chicken in the backyard, so to speak, that's kind of dying out. There's not as many people producing their own meat, their own eggs in their own backyards as there were in 1969, for example. So these egg farms are now, there's fewer of them, but they are large.
Well,
And that's
even
global.
Costco has they produce hundreds of thousands of chickens just so they can sell them for $5, and
Right.
right,
You're
and
talking
they're
about the
not healthy,
pre-cooked
and the
chicken.
pre-cooked, yeah.
Yeah. So, and that's to the point that it's like, these chicken farms, they're getting larger and larger and larger. So when you have an outbreak like this, the bird flu, the chance of that bird flu mutating and changing into something that it wasn't originally supposed to do because of the pre-programming that goes into the mRNA vaccines. Now you have a real problem. And that's why they're culling the way that they are. They're trying to get rid of the problem en masse. And it's not, I can't emphasize this enough. I know I look at the stats, the majority of our listeners are here in the United States, but there are countries all over the world who are having this problem. I think as of the recording of this, the only country that's not having this problem, which I think is kind of funny, is Australia. And I think that's just because of geography. They're a little bit more isolated. But there's a lot of countries in Africa, every continent except for Australia. Even Antarctica, I think it's shown up. I thought I read something like that, it's shown up there as well. So, and that's pretty isolated. So I don't know how Australia, if you're from Australia and you're listening to this, Natalie, I'm looking at you. I don't know how you escaped this, but, like I said, that's as of the recording of this. But yeah, it's a huge problem.
So to paraphrase Joel Salatin, what does this mean for Joe and Sally Homesteader? I know you said traditionally, it's interesting. Traditionally, people in the last 60 some years, 80 some years, I guess, in the 60s, are not raising chickens and so on. However, we've talked about raising chickens a few times on this podcast. We've been raising chickens for 10 some years. And we've heard that some people have had that interest getting into raising chickens even recently because of these events, because of prices going through the roof. They don't want to spend $10 for a dozen eggs, or 15 for 18, or whatever it's been the highest. Of course, it's different everywhere. So what does this mean for the typical homesteader, somebody who even is going to just raise a few chickens, much less 30 or so, like we're going to be doing these next few months? What does that mean for those people? Because if you get your chickens from a source like a hatchery, they're going to be vaccinated day one.
And what I didn't mention is that they're going to be vaccinated day one, and then later in the week they'll be revaccinated, especially for the Merck's disease. Because for efficacy purposes, they need to have that. So, if I could, that's what I would do. Especially if you're just going to raise a small flock, I would go ahead and hatch them out myself. I would try to locate a farmer who's willing to sell you fertilized eggs from chickens that have not been vaccinated. I would say to the person who is thinking about getting into backyard chickens, first of all, figure out what your tolerance is. Because looking at all of this data and all of the scientific research, we've been consuming and breeding chickens that have been getting this mRNA vaccine because that's been going on for many years now. And looking in hindsight now, it makes sense why when COVID first came out, that they immediately went to the mRNA vaccine because they had already been using it for many years prior to that on poultry. So, if you're worried about consuming it and it being, in you, for example, then you've likely, if you've eaten out anytime, prior to this, you probably have already consumed it. So I would just say figure out what your tolerance is. If you don't want that in your food system and you're going to be growing your own chickens, then my advice to you is go find a farmer who is raising chickens that has not been vaccinated in any way. Get fertilized eggs from them and hatch out your own eggs from there. That's what I would suggest. If your tolerance level is like, you know what, I will raise my own chickens, I'm going to do the best that I possibly can, then by all means, I would say probably the best thing to do is to get either your chickens from a local hatchery, a local farm, or a local store that you trust that's in your area that sells chicks, that doesn't buy it from a big hatchery and, the whole 9 yards. The key is local. I would try to get as local as I possibly could because the birds will be more conditioned for your area, as opposed to going onto a hatchery and saying, oh, I'd like these birds and that bird and this bird and that bird. They may not do good in your area. So you really kind of have to do your research. Make sure you have everything set up. The infrastructure, as we say, is very important. Know what you're doing. These are lives that you are dealing with, and you want to treat them accordingly. They're your animals. They are your responsibility. You want to make sure they're healthy, that they've got a good environment, that they're taking in good food, because at the end of the day, what they ingest is what you are ingesting.
You are what they ate.
Exactly. So with that in mind, it just depends on your tolerance. Just thinking out loud, the conclusion that I came to when I did all of this, and I was kind of putting all of this together for the podcast, I really had to go for a long walk in our woods and just really think about the implications and the repercussions of all of this. I was actually nervous to do this podcast because, I love science, but I'm not a scientist. But, just reading articles that have been published, science articles that are available for the public to read, it just really shows that, like I said, the Pandora's box on all of this has been opened. And the playing around with the genes and the genetic sequence and genomes and changing viruses, all of that, we don't know the implications. There's not been enough time to study the effects of what this has in the natural world. So the conclusion that I came to for myself is that we are going to have to homestead and farm like we've never done before. We are the first generation. Do you realize that? We are the first generation that is going to be dealing with these sort of viruses that mutate so rapidly and change so virulently and rapidly. We're going to have to homestead with biosecurity in mind. Our grandparents didn't have to do that, but we're the first. So if you're thinking of producing your own food, that is something that you're really going to have to think about is biosecurity. How do you prevent your animals from not just getting sick from the regular diseases that, let's say goats get, or, cattle, or, birds, as we've discussed, but now cross species viruses that are new, that we've never seen before. So that is something that we're really going to have to think long and hard about. So one of the things that I did is I tried to figure out, have any of the governments done anything to prevent these viruses from mutating any further, any outbreaks, anything like that. Again, I am referring to as of the recording of this, because at this point, there is, at least in the United States, Biden has just left office, and there's new President Trump. So there's a change in administration. So it could be that things might get a little bit different. But I do want to say this, that there is a funding that has been done. It's the funding the Chemical Biological Defense Program. President Biden asked for $81.7 billion, with a B, $billion over 5 years for pandemic preparedness. And that is about 1/10 of the expected cost of the H5N1 pandemic, potentially. And that begins this year. So the risk of the H5N1 over the next decade, or even the combined risk of other pathogens with the pandemic, it's probably, in other words, it's probably not going to be enough. So there's a lot of funding that needs to take place for the pandemic preparedness. Pandora's box has already been open, so the cat's out of the bag and it's running amok. So, there's really not much you or I can do about it. I don't even know that the governments can really do anything about it, but this is really a case of, the Bible says that man is ruining the earth, and far be it from me to, the Lord says what the Lord says, but man, ruining the earth just seems like it seems like it's a little bit mild. It feels more like he's just destroying the earth.
Yeah, it's more now like man is ruining the earth to the nth degree.
Yeah, exactly. On a level never seen before. But there are some things that the governments are trying to do, and they do try to put some things in place. So there is that as well.
All right. Well, thank you for taking this scientific journey with us.
Yeah.
And as always, we'd like to thank you for supporting us on the 2 Acre Homestead podcast. And be sure to check out the show notes. We'll have some more information, including links to articles and so on that support what we've been talking about today. So from all of us here to all of you out there,
happy homesteading.
And stay safe out there.